autism and shame. Why is this a topic that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about? Like, I'm sure the discourse is discoursing somewhere, but this is a topic that I talk about individually with my other autistic friends, even like some of my other neurodivergent ADHD friends, but it's not a topic that I feel like has been fully explored. Like, I looked like the entire like spectrum, pun intended, of autism research. There's not really any research or data about this. So I want to talk about shame because I struggle a lot with shame. And if you're watching this video, you probably do too. Now, shame is a feeling that I don't think I was ever able to identify as shame until I got my autism diagnosis at the age of 30. I went my entire life, like most of my adult life, believing that I was struggling with social anxiety and that I was feeling like embarrassed. And embarrassed just feels like such a superficial word for the feelings, like the really big feelings that I was dealing with. Shame and autism for me go hand in hand. And while this video is going to be through the lens of someone who is autistic, I think that there are broad principles that a lot of neurodivergent people, or honestly, like just most people, can probably relate to. But this, in my opinion, really is, at least some of the stuff that I'll talk about, very unique to the autistic experience. Because shame for me is the biggest and most crippling emotion that I deal with. Hi, I'm Rachel. I struggle with shame. So through grief, burnout, and other like really big feelings, I've started a path towards healing from shame and how it intersects and frankly informs my experiences. And I wanted to share some things with you about what I've learned, how to overcome shame, how to be more resilient around shame, where shame comes from if you are autistic. What is shame? I'm literally going to read the definition from a Psychology Today article because I think it is quite good. This is from Mary C. Lamia, PhD. She says, as a self-conscious emotion, shame informs us of an internal state of inadequacy, unworthiness, dishonor, regret, or disconnection. So like simply put, shame is this belief that we are not worthy of being loved, that we are unvaluable because of who we are. And there's a lot of things that can trigger shame. It can be around weight and physical appearance. It can be around relationships, academic success, career success. I feel like you can make a direct linkage with what society deems to be valuable and where a lot of shame comes from. And that's important because of the ways that autistic folks experience the world very differently and frankly value things that can be very different from a neurotypical society. Shame is very much informed by your relationships, not just our relationships with people, it's also our relationships with media, what we are exposed to, and all of the like relational aspects of our lives, like how we're interacting with people, how we're interacting with content, with other communities. All of that can inform why we don't feel valuable and why therefore we feel a lot of shame. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons, because autistic people are told day in and day out that they are not adequate, that they are not worthy, and that they need to change. Which brings me to masking. What really triggered me to want to make this video was listening to Brene Brown's Power of Vulnerability talk. I can't believe it's taken me this long to listen to it, but I was in tears crying listening to it. Not because she talks about autism at all, but the entire talk is about shame. And one thing that she said in particular immediately just sparked for me as an experience that a lot of people every single day deal with, but if you are autistic, masking is probably a part of your life. And what she said is this. Again, we're just gonna read. We walk in the stories of our own lives and we own them. Or we stand outside our stories and we hustle for our worthiness. Our worthiness lives inside our story. She goes on to say, many of us have orphaned parts of our stories that don't fit with who we think we're supposed to be, and orphaning our stories gives shame power. Let me repeat that. Many of us have orphaned parts of our stories that don't fit with who we think we're supposed to be. Orphaning our stories gives shame power. I think you can pretty clearly see where I'm going with this if you are autistic, but also if you're ADHD too. There's a car going by. I'm trying to talk about important things here. The most simple way that you can explain masking if you're autistic is that you are playing out a narrative of another person. Like it's like you're cosplaying as another person in order to be socially accepted, sometimes for your own physical or emotional safety. It is a betrayal of your story to mask, right? It is an experience that betrays fundamentally who you are as a person. It betrays every aspect of your personhood. But this is why people say masking is traumatic, because Brené Brown says in this book that shame and the response to shame comes from trauma. So if masking is fundamentally betraying who you are and betraying your story as a person, masking is therefore traumatic because it leads to the most immense feelings of shame. And that's really why when I talk to my autistic friends, people that I've met online in the real world, especially autistic women, the common thread between all of us is that we struggle deeply with shame. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that comes from betraying our stories, aka masking. And like for me, when I've been at my lowest, when I've struggled the most, it was in 2018 and 2019 when I was very close to checking myself into mental hospitals several times. There's a lot at play of what was happening in my life, but at the center of all of it was masking. Every aspect of our lives as autistic people is constantly being told that we're acting like weird at best, that we're being off-putting, that our behaviors aren't normal, that we should act different, that we're not socializing correctly, that we're being too quiet, that we're being too shy. Like everything is up for debate. Everything is up for criticism. And I think if you're very lucky, like I have been, that dissipates as you get older, you mature, and you find your self-worth. And if you're extremely lucky, like I have been, you surround yourself with people who love you no matter what, and you don't need to mask for the most part. But because shame is so informed by our early years and so informed by our relationships and how we interact with other people, if you're autistic and you get to the age of 33, like I am, and you find yourself not feeling even like a little bit of shame, you're probably very lucky and an anomaly, right? If you're going your entire life where your entire story, right, your story is being criticized from every angle and you're being told that you aren't worthy, that you aren't lovable, that you aren't worthy of love, then you're going to grow up believing those things about your story. You're going to believe those criticisms about your story are accurate and that you indeed are not worthy of love and that you should, as Brené Brown says, orphan your story. Now, Brené Brown also says in this book that the key to overcoming shame is walking in our stories and owning them. I translate that for autism as unmasking. Now, this is where it gets really complicated, and this is where a lot of my big feelings have started to come up recently. If shame is this belief that you are, or this fear that you are not worthy of love and that you are not valuable, and autism is so informed by almost like this habitual act of shame towards our very personhood, which then causes us to mask. There comes a point in your life, and this is what I faced at the age of 30 after getting my autism diagnosis and realizing like, it wasn't just like typical social anxiety, but I'm crippled by shame. There comes a point where you become hyper aware of your shame triggers, and your shame triggers, at least for me, and I suspect for a lot of other autistic people, are directly correlated to masking. So what does that mean? That means that every time that you engage in masking, and the reality is that it is probably very, very rare that as an autistic person that you will never have to mask again. Like even as somebody who walks through the world with a lot of privilege, I still mask on a daily basis. I don't mask frequently, but I do mask to the point where I notice it. And I notice it because it is a shame trigger for me, because it's a betrayal of me. It's a betrayal of my story. And that's why I've been so crippled by shame most of my life. So when you get to the point when you're starting to learn how to unmask, to embrace your stems, to embrace that you talk a little bit differently, that you socialize a little bit differently, that maybe the way that you've spoken in a way that was like kind of like a Valley Girl affect and like very like fun and silly was actually just a performance, so people wouldn't make fun of you for having a very flat affect. I'm just projecting now, but you get the point. Once you get to the point where you are unmasking and you're starting to learn who you are inside your story, as Brené Brown would say, you become extremely aware of when you are masking. And that's a shame trigger. It triggers this feeling that you are not valuable and that you are not worthy until you start to mask. And it's like this circular experience where you don't feel loved or worthy because you're being criticized for your autistic traits. So then you begin to mask. And then once you begin to mask, you realize how shameful it feels to betray your entire personhood. So then you start to feel even more shame on top of that, and you end up back where you were from the beginning. I firmly believe this is one of the most under-researched and under-spoken about experiences of autism, is like this link of shame, betrayal of identity, and your autistic identity. Now, I would be lying if I said, like, these are the 4 ways that you overcome your shame triggers as an autistic person. No, this is what I struggle with the most in my life. And I am somebody who would confidently say that I've been quite successful in my life, that I have built a lot of confidence, that my self-worth has improved over the years. It's still something that on a weekly basis, I find myself laying on the floor crying because I feel so ashamed. So if you struggle with this too, just know that a lot of us are struggling with this. This is something that affects more people than I think we even realize. And I think when we talk about shame, it is such an isolating experience. It's something that, until I heard other autistic women specifically talking about their own experiences, like directly with me, about how ashamed they felt, I felt like I was alone in this. This felt like the most isolating thing, that nobody could ever understand, that this was like unique to me. And like, how self-absorbed is that, right? Like, these are, when you back up and you think about it, this macro concept of masking and this betrayal of who we are as people and betraying our own stories, it feels like a very common thread across many identities, but especially in this context, the autistic identity. I hope that that gives you a little bit of validation that you don't sit alone in your shame, and this is something that I think connects more of us than we realize. Now, in order to understand how we move forward with this, I've looked towards Brené Brown's 4 components of overcoming shame. The first thing that she recommends to do is recognizing shame and understanding its triggers. Now, obviously, this is going to look different for you as it is from me, but I think broadly speaking, I feel decently confident in saying that the connective point of shame for most autistic people is masking. So when she talks about recognizing shame, that unfortunately is part of your unmasking journey. When I think about the moments that have given me the most shame, it's when I was behaving in a way that just fundamentally was not who I was, pretending to be interested in things that I could care less about, and trying to impress people that frankly didn't give a damn about me. So why was I trying to make them love me when there are plenty of people in this world who love me anyways? And the reason why I know I was struggling so much was because I was masking in a way that felt like the ultimate betrayal to who Rachel is. So in hindsight, I'm very clearly able to see what my shame triggers are. And I'm kind of bucketing shame triggers into like my masking behaviors, because I believe shame and masking are so linked together. I think it's really beneficial to start to identify, how do you feel after you mask? I know a lot of autistic folks report feeling like really tired, burnt out, overstimulated, and all that is certainly true, but a less common and less articulated experience that I don't hear from a lot of people is that they feel shame. And identifying when you feel the most shame is certainly a part of that. I have like my list of things that cause me the most shame, and they're all related to masking. And that leads to Brené's second point of components of overcoming shame: practicing critical awareness of the influences that lead to shame. The influences that lead to masking are things that a lot of us can't control in some situations. If you're somebody who masks for your social safety, for your emotional safety, it's not as easy as just like, well, just remove yourself from those situations. Because what if you go to school in a place where you don't have any other options, and like that's your school, and if you were to unmask, you'd be putting yourself in an unsafe environment. Or if you live in a place where the people around you are not accepting of your autistic traits. You see what I mean? For a lot of autistic people, it's not as easy as, well, just remove yourself from those environments where you have to mask. Yes, for those of us who are quite privileged, it is a little bit more simple. I think especially as you become later in your life and begin to surround yourself, hopefully, with a community of people who love you, who trust you, and you trust them. But if you're in a place, in a space where it is not emotionally safe or physically safe, or even poses a significant like social threat to your life that would affect your livelihood, thinking about if you're at work and you work in an environment that is not going to be accepting of your autistic traits, and it will not be simple for you to just find another job These are all scenarios that make it incredibly complex for autistic people to just unmask. That being said, I do think that there are ways to understand the influences that lead to you masking or then lead to you feeling shame. For example, with my work, it's very social, right? Like the media industry requires a lot of socialization. And a lot of my shame was coming from like putting on this performance in order to fit in these like highly social environments. What I do instead is sometimes I'm not able to like physically unmask at a professional setting, whether it's in a meeting, a presentation, whatever. But what I am able to do is be much more choosy about these social environments that I put myself into. Whether it's choosing to not go to like a big blowout party, which I don't do anymore, to deciding to not go to a dinner, but instead show up for a drink in order just to connect with a couple of people in a one-on-one way that actually doesn't really require me to mask. Having that awareness of what works for me and what doesn't work for me has allowed me to be a lot more discerning and have that critical awareness that Brown talks about that helps me mitigate the very worst of the shame. The third thing that Brene Brown says you should do is reach out to others. No man, woman, non-binary babe is an island. I think as autistic people, we really default to isolating ourselves and going into ourselves, going into our world, going into our head. I certainly do this, and there's nothing wrong with being a very introverted and sometimes quiet person who lives in your own head. But I also know that community is everything that we are. And you don't need a big community. You just need one person. You just need a person who feels safe, a person who understands. And even if that person is not accessible to you in the physical world, it's why it's so important for autistic communities to support each other, to take care of each other, because so many of us can be so isolated. And I know at my very worst in my life, the isolation that I felt around the shame that I was feeling was the most debilitating thing that I've ever felt, and it led to very harmful thoughts. And it is such a gift that we have a community online of other autistic people, other neurodivergent people. So if you're ever feeling completely isolated and you don't know where to turn with the shame or the masking that you're dealing with, just remember that despite all of the garbage in the world today, we do live in a really amazing time where we are so lucky to be able to go onto a subreddit and post exactly what we're feeling and probably have somebody comment and say, yeah, me too. And the final thing that Brene Brown says that you can do is naming shame when it occurs. Naming shame when it occurs, I think, is the easiest part of this because we have moved through the world living in shame for most of our life in a way that is so intrinsic to our identity that I think it becomes very easy once you understand that like what you're feeling around your mask and your performance is shame. It becomes very simple to identify that feeling. Like I know for me with shame, I have like physical responses to shame. It's not just psychological or emotional, although that is the most intense aspect of it. With shame, I feel physically nauseous sometimes. I get a headache. My palms get numb. And even if it's not that intense for you and shame is something that you just feel emotionally, and I say just as if it's not the most horrible feeling in the world, I think it becomes very simple once you realize this is shame that I'm feeling to name it when it occurs. Something that I've started practicing when this happens is I will reach out to one of my best friends and I will text her and say, this thing just happened and I feel really ashamed. And I just label it for what it is. I don't attach any analysis to it. I'm not trying to analyze my feelings in the moment and justify what in childhood caused me to feel this way. No, I just label it as it happened and I feel ashamed. And it's usually the empathy for, again, going back to number 3 of reaching out to somebody and having them commiserate with me and say, I understand, or I've gone through that too, or that must have been really hard. Labeling it and then connecting with somebody over that label is so healing. Feeling humiliation about who you are as a person and the things that you love and the things that make you wonderful and valuable and worthy as a person simply by the nature of who you are. Feeling devalued about all of that is the worst feeling in the world. I'm just a girl on the internet talking about her own experiences with shame, but I hope at the very least this gave you some validation that you aren't alone. And this is something that regardless of where you come from in life, if you are autistic, you probably struggle with shame. I see you, I love you, and I hope you take care of yourself. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It does help my channel quite a bit, and don't forget to subscribe. You can also find me on TikTok and on Instagram, and I really appreciate you spending your time with me today.